Machiavelli, of course, is a polarizing figure, and a lot of the antinomies that come up in our way of conducting politics are brought to the surface here in this great and most influential of political thinkers. He was born in 1469 and died in 1527. This was the period of the golden age of the Florentine Renaissance. And he spent much of his time when he was serving the Republic of Florence, serving in the interregnum of the Medici dominance of the city. For years when he was serving in the second chancery of Florence, walking by the statue of Michelangelo's David outside the entrance of the Palazzo Vecchio. And that reminded him of the self-image of Florence as the one who could take on the Goliaths of the world. He was always a Republican in fundamental sentiments. That's clear in the discourses on Livy, and he was in fact an inspiration to even John Adams in that respect. And that's one of the things we have to grapple with. How foreign is Machiavelli to an American way of approaching politics, a Christian way of approaching politics, a classical way? How modern is he? How ancient is he? The times that he lived in were still, depending on the periodization and the specialist of the person historian you're looking at, this is still possibly the late medieval age when he's born. But of course, this is certainly the high Renaissance also. And that indicates the kinds of ambiguities that we have to deal with in terms of where we are in history at this point, and indeed where we are now with regard to the classical patrimony and the medieval legacies. What really is going on here, and it's something I've been tracking throughout this semester, is the shift towards a more secular way of living with the increase of commerce after the long centuries of inanition in that field after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And we see, because of the rise of commercial enterprise, we have the rise of the lay state. And this is basically the time we're still living in as far as the dominance of a secular set of calculations. And that's going to leave an imprint, though the Renaissance itself was overwhelmingly a Christian movement, though you do not see, obviously, much interest in Machiavelli for the religious questions. The early part of the 15th century is usually assigned to the notion of civic humanism as opposed to the later, more philosophical humanism that would especially flourish under Lorenzo de Medici. But Machiavelli, though coming later, is absolutely a civic humanist. And so we have to say a little bit about the humanist tradition. Petrarch, obviously, who died in 1374, is the one that we most identify with the growth of this new way of approaching education, cultivation of the human, the studia humanitatis, right? The study of the human thing. And the Abigail Adams Institute is explicitly an institute meant to supplement humanistic education. So we didn't get to read Petrarch this semester. There's too many things to go over, but that ideal is very much the ideal of AAI, even though there are definitely different emphases. If you know anything about the educational wars of the 20th century, the mid 20th century, you have real conflict between the classical basis, which had dominated for centuries, coming from the Renaissance of studying Latin and Greek as the basis, and then you have a new middlebrow emphasis on the great books, and obviously there's a lot of that model here. And my own beloved Mortimer Adler was the great engine behind that, but I see myself no reason to set the two against each other. But there's a difference there that actually for Petrarch it mattered, and this was a disagreement he had with Dante. For Petrarch, not the vernacular, but the the most beautiful Latin is the thing, and then and Greek, because the humanists were so instrumental in recovering for Western Europe the great riches of the East, of especially Greek literature, which was largely lost as a language to the West. The big difference as far as how the medievals, so-called, by this point, by Petrarch's own periodization of history, we got the Middle Ages. He was looking back on an age that he found decadent because of the language, for instance, that he found the subsequent development of Latin not pleasing, not aesthetically fine, and therefore indicating something deeper about the soul behind that. Petrarch so gives us the notion of Middle Ages between the ancient and what we now would think of as the modern, but for him, they were on the verge of some new birth, they hoped. But the Middle Ages obviously was rooted in the ancient world. They thought of themselves as Romans. It was always that way, and they certainly always had Latin classics. So the big difference, I think, has to do with how Renaissance thinkers and medieval thinkers related to the common classical past would be the growth of cities, frankly. I think that's the urban civic republicanism of Florence and the other northern Italian city-states in particular gave a similar sociological setting as you would have seen in Athens or in Rome, where in fact the great political thinker Hannah Arendt talks about this, that in the ancient world you had a vital, at least for a certain class of people, a vital responsibility to participate in the common life of government. And that, of course, passes away with the feudal age because there's no need for the people in any mode to engage in civic deliberation for self-government. And so the arrival of Florence, because of its great success initially, well, above all, with the woolen cloth manufacture that they depended on, and the banking that rose on that basis, they had the material conditions for a flourishing under these conditions of civic republicanism. There was also, and this is very relevant for our time, given the pandemic crisis, we have a choice as a world now, as the world did after the plague struck the Great Mortality, the Black Death, in the middle of the 14th century. What we saw in Europe was, in fact, a choice to innovate. And so the Renaissance would eventually come out of that devastation, massive devastation of that plague. And that's a choice we have to make too. After there's going to be a lot of devastation we will have to grapple with. And the question is, will we be vital about it, or will we be despairing about it? The great humanistic ideal of sapientia et eloquentia, to both be wise in the study of various subjects, but also to be eloquent, to communicate, that was the basis for the eventual, that would become a requirement for the participating in the government of Florence. So the liberal arts were supplemented by, so liberal arts obviously persisted into the Middle Ages, but it was the addition of the study of history and of poetry in particular that made the study of the liberal arts so different in the Renaissance. What you do see with the changing material basis of life, the growing commercialism, growing wealth, growing lay tenor of life, you have a developing autonomous realm of action, and that's the realm that Machiavelli is to be cited in. 15th century Florence saw the establishment of Medici rule, so even though there were still republican forms, it was in fact controlled by this family. It was Medici hegemony, so that would be kind of parallel to the way the Roman Empire took over from the Republic. The forms may have been preserved, but the reality was gone. Lorenzo de Medici, the Magnificent, became the Gran Maestro in 1469, the year of Machiavelli's birth. And these were the great golden years of the Florentine Renaissance. He was a patron of Botticelli and Michelangelo, and Leonardo was in the court, and so on. It was a remarkable age. Lorenzo died in 1492. Of course, that's the year of the European discovery of the New World, and so everything was changing very rapidly at this point. The Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, took over in that same year, and he wanted to find a place for his son. So that's a mark of how different those ages were, when a pope could have a son and acknowledge it publicly. And that son was Cesare Borgia, who is such an important presence in the prince. And Cesare was fitted out to try to take over a territory, and those battles would have been fought in the northeastern land of Romagna. And that his way of dealing with both opportunity, fortuna, and his own personality, that's going to be something we will spend some time talking about tonight. During this period after Lorenzo's death, while Lorenzo was operating, and then after his death, the Dominican friar Savonarola was active. He was preaching on the first letter of St. John and the book of Revelation, and his apocalyptic, in the colloquial sense, preaching was set the city on fire. Well, not quite literally, though. He did come up with the bonfire of the vanities, where you would have all these worldly things thrown into the fire. So he combined a republican sentiment with religious reform and a fierce puritanical streak. His preaching got everybody excited, and in that milieu, King Charles VIII of France was lured into attacking Italy because of the possibility of taking over the Kingdom of Naples. So he invaded in 1494. His army swept down the peninsula, subdued Florence, and that year, 1494, was decisive for the Italian peninsula because it opened the floodgates of foreign interventionism. You had Swiss armies, you had French, you had the Holy Roman Empire threatening, and you had Spanish armies. So for someone who was a patriot like Machiavelli, he wanted to see these armies gone. And he would also share that with somebody like Julius II, the Pope who succeeded Alexander. The Medicis were driven out after the French invasion of 1494. The Republic was restored, and this is when Machiavelli was able to join the government. Pisa rebelled, which was the town that they needed to control because they needed access to the sea. Florence is landlocked, right? But Pisa rebelled in 1496. This is one of those stories that Machiavelli learns from, because he was sent to the French court to get help to subdue the Pisan rebellion. Well, the Pisan rebellion was not able to be subdued even with French help, and he was sent to talk to the French ruler at that time, Louis XII, about what went wrong. And he realized that Florence wasn't thought of as David by the great powers of the earth. It was thought of as pathetic because it couldn't get the job done. He met with many people on his diplomatic missions after his accession to the Second Chancery in 1498 in the new and anti-Savonarolan government that was set up there. He served in that capacity the 10 of War, the committee that would handle basically diplomatic relations. So he met with Caterina Sforza of Forlì, Louis XII, Emperor Maximilian, Cesare Borgia. It was at the conclave that elected the successor of Alexander VI, Julius II, and so on. So it was based on wide diplomatic experience that Machiavelli could write his book. Julius II was, in the end, backed by Cesare, and this was one of those big mistakes that we hear about in the selections we read from the prince, that his father, Alexander, had exiled Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, the man who would become Julius II, had exiled him. So Machiavelli said, this is stupid to think that you could bet on a man who has received such wrong from your father. And indeed, when Julius was elected Pope, he reneged on his promises to Cesare, and that was, in the end, the ignominious conclusion to Cesare's ambitions. Julius II was very eager to rid the peninsula of barbarians. He wanted to go to crusade against France, and he signed in 1511 the Holy League with King Ferdinand of Spain. And unfortunately, Florence had not declared for the Pope, did not want to antagonize France, so they had bet wrong. And at that point, the Spanish armies came into the peninsula, sacked the neighboring town of Prato, and that caused the collapse of the Republican government. The Medici returned, and that was the end of Machiavelli's life in government. He was tortured on the misapprehension of his having engaged in conspiracy against the Medici, and he retired to Sant'Andrea, a little farm south of Florence. Early in 1513, now that the Medici were back in power, in fact, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X, and so now you had this remarkable concurrence of power both on the papal throne and in Florence. And so when Machiavelli writes The Prince in 1513, he's looking at, he's still an Italian patriot, he still wants to have a Republican form of government, but he's willing to work with the strong men, to work with the Medici family to do what needs to be done. And the Medici, with both papal and Florentine power, it looked like they were in a position to maybe do what needed to be done to clear out the Italian lands. And so he also just wanted to be back into politics. So he wrote The Prince, clearly partly as a way of gaining favor. And he's also just writing his thoughts about what it takes to actually win in the game of politics. So a few notes about the book itself. If this may not be too clear, but the typology he begins with he says their polities can come either as principalities or as republics. He's not going to treat republics, even though that's where his heart is. Then he's going to he divides principalities into new principalities, or those that have already existed, hereditary principalities. And then he divides the new into either those that are completely new or those that have been annexed to the lands of a prince who already has his own territory. And then the completely new, he divides into the ones that you gain by arms, your own arms and virtu, or the ones that have been gained through foreign arms and fortuna. And it's going to be those in particular, those last ones that have been so conditioned by fortune and what's out of one's control, that will be his main subject matter. But along the way, he says things about each of these forms of government. That, of course, is the situation of the Medici after their return to power. It was because of Spanish arms and because of this fortune that they were able to do what they did in terms of returning to power. So the other thing to keep in mind is that this book, The Prince, is an example of a genre, a mirror for princes, going back to antiquity, writing advice for those who rule. And the great enemy really isn't Christianity or whatever, it's Cicero. It's clear that Machiavelli is reversing many of the key contentions of Cicero's book, De Officiis, on duties. And above all, there's this, Cicero complains about the pernicious doctrine that a thing may be morally right without being expedient, and expedient without being morally right. And clearly, Machiavelli's challenging that straight to the heart. Another thing to keep in mind is how fortune is figured differently in the antique, the classical, and the medieval. You go from the image of the cornucopia, where the goddess Fortuna is to those she favors, is pouring out her abundance. And then what you see in Boethius' Constellation of Philosophy is this notion of Fortuna in the Christian worldview is simply this kind of samsaric wheel of change. And in the end, like the Augustinian notions, that you get used to, once you recognize, you see this a little when we read the Thomistic passages on happiness, when you see that the external goods of fortune, they don't get assigned rationally to people because of merit. They fall randomly. That's their fortune. And Machiavelli stands more with the ancients in this, that they both believe that you can actually woo fortune, the goddess fortune. And of course, there's some very sexist language in there about how you handle this woman. But that's a very decisive difference between the medieval and the classical and / Renaissance view here. In the end, I'll wrap up here, the question of bowing to circumstances is something that Machiavelli is just demonstrating in his book. He's writing a book for princes when he's a Republican. He's writing for the Medici. But his point is, you've got to do what it takes to recognize where fortune has placed you. You've got to bend your personality to meet the circumstances that are at hand. And so we've got the questions here. Does Machiavelli seem as shocking as his reputation would indicate? Are there passages that surprise you, either for being traditional or for being modern? How has Machiavelli shifted the meaning of virtue? Are morality and power irreconcilable? Does truth have need of power? Number 3, what makes for a happy life according to Machiavelli? Does he help us understand what ends we should be pursuing? How does he change the practice of political theory? And number 4, how do you make provision for changes of fortune in your life, in your own life? How should we make provision for such events as a people?